Hey, this is Jamey Stegmeyer with Stonemeyer Games, and today I'm going to talk about my favorite games, my top 10 favorite games that use a simultaneous action selection mechanism. So let me talk about a little bit about what that is. And really, it came to light recently when I was actually playing Chocolate Factory. This is one of the games I was playing. Where in Chocolate Factory, there are a couple different phases every turn, phases that you're going through. But one of those phases is that you just simply run your factory. All players do this at the same time. They're pushing this little tile through this factory. They're doing this, and they're gaining benefits. They're deciding when to pull stuff off their assembly line, and they're just doing this at the same time. I'm not paying attention to what you're doing. You're not paying attention to me doing to what I'm doing. There's still player interaction in other phases, but during that main phase, we were just kind of running our factories. And I was delighted by it. It was wonderful that I didn't have to wait for another player to puzzle out their turn, and that I had the freedom to puzzle out my turn without feeling like I was slowing down all the other players. And it was a very puzzly, that's the very puzzly part of the game. And so I wanted to look more into other games that use and really feature a simultaneous action selection. And I found that games do it in a lot of different ways. As I looked through this mechanism, I found that there were a couple different categories of games that use this mechanism. Drafting games, programming games, roll and writes even often have a large amount of simultaneous play. Real-time games have it. So it was a little tough to come up with this list, but I've tried to break it down as best to the best of my ability. And I only have 2 games that I own to show you. The rest are kind of honorable mentions. Like I could have thrown QE in there. In QE, you write down your bid simultaneously. Didn't feel quite right for a simultaneous action selection game. On Tour, a roll and write that I love, fully qualifies for this. Everyone's doing everything simultaneously, but for some reason it also didn't feel quite right for this list. I'm not quite sure why. I'm kind of going with my gut feeling here. The Mind, you make choices simultaneously. There are no turns in the Mind. Also didn't feel quite right for the list, as much as I love this game. Second Chance, another roll and write that could have gone on this list, just didn't feel quite right. Isle of Skye, you're placing your bid simultaneously, but the turns that you're actually taking in this turn are not simultaneous. So didn't feel quite right putting this on my list, even though I love that game. So let's get to the list. Number 10 is The Reckoners. The Reckoners is a cooperative game that uses a simultaneous action selection mechanism, and it's really, really cool. Basically, there's a big phase in Reckoners where you just do stuff. You're doing most of the things that you're doing in the game. The Reckoners is a cooperative superhero game where you are fighting against the superheroes. You do not have superpowers yourself. And you're rolling dice, you're placing dice in certain places. It isn't a real-time game. You're not limited by any time period. But you're doing all this simultaneously with other players. And it leads to a lot of open table collaboration, where I say, okay, I've got some dice that I can use for this. Can you guys do this? Can someone take care of this problem over here? I can take care of this thing over here. And you're doing this in real time and shifting around. And it really ends up feeling like not superhero collaboration, but a cooperative collaboration where you're fighting against superheroes, where you're communicating and trying to get the job done. So I really like how the Reckoners uses a major simultaneous action selection phase in the game. Actually, I just realized I had some other honorable mentions that weren't on my shelf. I'll mention them at the end of this list, since I'm already inside the list now. And I will do a little bit of a design discussion at the end of this list. Number 9 is Fantastic Factory. It's one of the other games that made me really start thinking about this. Very similar to Chocolate Factory, there is a phase in the game, a major phase of the game, where you are simply running your factory in this game. So this is a game where you're acquiring cars, you're building an engine, and then you're rolling dice and placing those dice on different cards to activate your engine. And that dice placement and activation of cards, it's complicated, it's puzzly, and it happens simultaneously. And the game, I think, is much better for that, rather than having players do that one by one around the table. So that's why Fantastic Factories is my number 9 game with this simultaneous action mechanism. My number 8 is Atlantis Rising, another cooperative game that uses a simultaneous action selection mechanism. This would be very tough to pull off in a competitive game, especially in real time. But it's brilliant how Atlantis Rising pulls this off in a cooperative game, because again, it leads to the same thing as the Reckoners, where I might think about placing a worker here, but as I'm placing it, someone else might say, "Oh, Jamey, I really need that spot. We really need to do this round. Can you go someplace else?" And I might say, "Well, no, I really need that spot too." And we might talk about it then. And so it's happening. We're having this collaboration in real time about where the workers need to go. And I really, really like how that works out in Atlantis Rising, my number 8 game in this category. My number 7 game, I mentioned programming games, and Mechs vs. Minions, I think, is my favorite programming game. Mechs vs. Minions is another cooperative game. Apparently this simultaneous action selection works really well in cooperative games. Mechs vs. Minions is a game where you are programming cards in a big tableau in front of you, and then simultaneously with all players, you are that part actually isn't simultaneous. The programming is simultaneous. The actual actions are not simultaneous. But the programming leads to this chaotic fun happening on the board, because the thing that you hoped would happen when you programmed your mech may not end up actually happening on the board, depending on the board state at the time. So I really like programming. Sometimes is not fun for me because I don't like thinking quite that far ahead. But in a cooperative game where it can get a little chaotic, it just ends up being a lot of fun. And that's why Mechs vs. Minions is my number 7 in this category. My number 6 is a game that I loved having on my shelf for years, but my friends kind of stopped wanting to play it, and that is Libertalia. Libertalia is a pirate-themed game where simultaneously you are choosing a card from your hand, a character card from your hand, putting it face down on the table, and then everyone flips those cards and you put them on the ship and activate them in a specific order. And all those decisions matter. The character you choose matters. The order in which the characters are activated matters. Those are the main 2 things, really. Just those 2 things. But I love that simultaneous decision. And even though it is only part of the game, that's not the entire part of the game, the fact that that decision is simultaneous really matters in Libertalia, because if you played cards one by one, you would just have too much information. The whole game is evolves out of the idea that you don't know the other characters that other players are playing, and the player interaction in the game is you are constantly trying to figure out, you're trying to think, what are these other characters that each other player is playing, and how can I use my character at a time that is better for me than those other characters. As I'm saying this, it reminds me, there's an Uwe Rosenberg game that uses the same mechanism. I'm blanking on the name now. Maybe you can say it in the comments. But there's an Uwe Rosenberg mechanism where you are choosing a character, and if other players have activated or not, it matters in the game. But Libertalia I just love, and that's why it's my number 6. We're in the top 5 here. It was a little bit hard to sort these top 5 because I really, really love these games. The number 5 is Bunny Kingdom. Bunny Kingdom is a drafting game. Drafting is a game that at least where you're using the type of draft where you're passing things around the table instead of drafting from a public pool. These games use a lot of simultaneous mechanisms because you're choosing at the same time as other players. With the Magic, I didn't even include a Magic draft on here, but Magic, that's one of my favorite things to draft, do a Magic booster draft. But Bunny Kingdom, aside from Magic, is one of my favorite ways to draft. And actually, I'll mention my number 4 here too. I'll say 7 Wonders, because these 2 are back-to-back drafting games. Bunny Kingdom at number 5, 7 Wonders at 4. I love the simultaneous draft in both of these games, especially since I'm making a decision that impacts other players around me, but I'm making it at the same time as those other players, which really cuts down on playing time, even at higher player counts. Especially at 7 Wonders, you're not adding extra playing time because everyone's doing it at the same time. You're making your choice at the same time. Bunny Kingdom is unique because you're drafting 2 cards, and then you're activating those cards. You're doing something else with those cards, but you're also doing that simultaneously as well. The game is designed so that you're not making conflicting choices at the time that you're activating the cards. Really, really clever game. At 7 Wonders, same thing. The vast majority of 7 Wonders is the simultaneous selection and then activation of the cards, which happens at the same time as all other players. So that's number 5 and 4, Bunny Kingdom, and then 7 Wonders. What's next? Number 3, right? Number 3 is Orleans. Orleans captured me from the first moment I played it. This is a game where you are bag building. In fact, there's another bag building game coming up on this list. You are bag building in Orleans and drawing workers out of a bag and then placing them on your own private action selection mat where you're placing those tokens and activating a variety of different actions. And that part of the game, there's another part of the game that isn't quite simultaneous, but that part of the game, the actual placement, like the puzzle of the game, the meat of the game, is happening simultaneously with all other players. You're not waiting turn by turn as players draw tokens out of a bag. This is one of the advantages that a bag builder has over a deck builder, in my opinion. It's a little bit easier to have this simultaneous mechanism than in a deck building game. Although maybe it's not impossible. I don't exactly see why more deck builders aren't as simultaneous as Orleans and my number 2, Quacks of Quedlinburg, which is also a simultaneous bag building game where you're drawing tiles out of the bag and pushing your luck simultaneously with the other players. In this phase of the game, there is no interaction with other players. There's like a few tokens that maybe look at other players, but you can easily see what other players have pulled out of their bag at any given time. And so you're able to do it simultaneously in Quacks of Quedlinburg rather than taking individual turns and doing it one by one. That changes actually in the final round of Quacks, and it's like this. Even though it's a dramatic round, it's the slowest round because everyone, while they're picking simultaneously, you are kind of waiting to see what everyone else is doing. Whereas in the main phases of the game, all the other rounds of the game, you're making that choice simultaneously. Even the buy phase in Quacks is simultaneous, as far as I know. That's how we play the game. And actually, even as I'm saying this, I'm remembering that Tigris, trading on the Tigris is also another simultaneous game where there's simultaneous trading. That would be maybe an honorable mention for this list. Number one, we have Cartographers. I ended up choosing a roll and write for my number 1. Perhaps that doesn't belong on the list, but I'm just having so much fun with Cartographers, and I wanted to give it my number 1 pick. This exemplifies, I think, what a simultaneous action selection game looks like, because everything is simultaneous. You are always drawing simultaneously in this game. So there's really, this game could scale up to quite a few more players, but it technically only goes up to 4 out of the box. But 4, I believe it's 4. But yeah, in Cartographers, you are building a map of a kingdom. Here's what it looks like on the back of the box. You're building this map. You're flipping a card, and then all players will draw simultaneously on their map to help build it. Cartographers also has a really neat phase where if a monster comes up, you'll actually pass your entire player map to the player on your left or the right, and they will draw the monster on your map, kind of disrupting your plans a little bit. So this adds interaction within a simultaneous action selection game. So as I mentioned, there's some honorable mentions that I forgot. Trade on the Tigris is one of them. Resistance Avalon, Incan Gold, Meeple Circus, Spirit Island, and Captain Sonar were all honorable mentions that I don't own. Actually, I own Avalon, but the rest of them I don't own right now, but they have major action selection, simultaneous action selection elements to them. But as I said, I ended my list at number 1 with Cartographers. So those are my top 10. It's a weird list to make, as I said, and but I do have some design discussion points that I want to mention here. And one actually occurred to me as I was talking about the Reckoners. I'm not sure if I can actually remember it now. I don't know if I can. But anyway, as I mentioned before, for Chocolate Factory and Fantastic Factories, I think... this is what I was going to mention. These games work really well because the main puzzly part of the game happens simultaneously. You don't have to wait for other players. However, the one downside here, and this is not necessarily a downside, but something to keep an eye on, I think, in game design for simultaneous action, is that you're not really seeing if other players are messing up or not. Whereas if players are taking turns one by one, you can easily see if a player has messed up their turn, if they've done something wrong or not. I could use the term cheating here, but I have found so few people in the tabletop space who actively cheat that in my opinion, it isn't worth discussing. Obviously, these types of games would not work for tournament play because it would be very hard to look at other players. But very few of these games are played, I think, or even considered for tournament play. But I think it is worth, if you're trying to teach the game, you can use that phase to slow down and maybe keep an eye on another player if you're actively doing that. But it is hard to actively keep an eye on other players unless you're really trying to do that in these puzzly simultaneous action selection games. I also mentioned these games scale up really well. That is a huge upside. Seven Wonders scales up so well because players are making their choices simultaneously. However, the flip side of that is that if you have one really slow player, then it slows everyone down perhaps even worse than a game where you're taking turns one by one, because everyone at the table in the Seven Wonders game, say you're playing 7 players, 7 Wonders, 6 players may have made their decision, and they might just be sitting there for minutes while the slowest player at the table takes their turn. I think it probably does this better than games where you're taking individual turns anyway, but it doesn't completely solve that problem, and I'm not sure there's a way to even design your way out of it. I think there's a game called... I forgot the name of this game. It's a drafting game that I mentioned before, where you draft and then you choose the player that you are passing to, and so there's a little bit of an incentive there to make a fairly quick decision so that you can choose who's going to get the pile of tiles next that you're passing. I think that's an interesting way of working around that, encouraging players to make a faster decision. There's also less downtime. One of the big pros of these games is that there's less downtime in a simultaneous action selection game because you are making the decisions at the same time as all the other players. You're not waiting for anyone. And even in games where the Seven Wonders example I gave, even if you are waiting for other players to make a decision, you can still be looking at your tableau, your strategy. You can be thinking about that while that one final person is taking their turn. Of course, that can also happen in a game where you're taking individual turns, but I think it works even better in these simultaneous games. Last, in some instances, these games can lead to less interaction. Maybe I shouldn't have even considered Cartographers for the list for this reason, because the core of the game, the writing on your own map, has no interaction with other players. Whereas some of the other games, like the cooperative games I mentioned, Atlantis Rising, Mechs versus Minions, the Reckoners, there's lots of interaction that comes out of the simultaneous play. Lots of real-time collaboration that comes out of the simultaneous play in those games. I am working on a cooperative game myself, and I'm trying to use a more simultaneous, or kind of a balance between individual turns and simultaneous play in the cooperative game. It's tough for me to design in that space. It's surprisingly hard to design in the space of having players take simultaneous choices instead of individual turns, which is the way I'm used to designing. But it's a fun challenge to consider, especially in a cooperative game. I think opens up that space a little bit to have that real-time collaboration, real-time decisions with the other players. Or not necessarily even real-time, but simultaneous decisions with the other players. I think that's all for my design thoughts. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. It's possible that you will bring up games that you love that may not quite qualify, in my opinion, as a simultaneous action selection game, but that's fine. Like I mentioned Incan Gold as an honorable mention because players are deciding to stay in or out of the cave simultaneously or not, or the temple, and that's the main decision you make in the game. But you're not really. I mean, it just happens to be a simultaneous choice. It wouldn't make sense in this game for players to choose one by one. It just doesn't work in that game. So it didn't feel quite right choosing it. But for you, that might be a full-fledged simultaneous action selection mechanism, and that's okay for you to mention in the comments. I'd love to hear a few of your favorite games that use the simultaneous action selection games and mechanism. Maybe some games that don't use it that you think might benefit from having this type of mechanism, or the type of game that you'd like to see this mechanism more in. And really, any of your thoughts, I'm curious about hearing this. I'm going to learn from you as a designer, and I'd love to hear about more games that use this mechanism, because I really have fallen in love with the idea of puzzling out something simultaneously with other players, like in Orleans, Fantastic Factories, Chocolate Factory, rather than waiting for other players to puzzle out things one by one on their turns. So yeah, I really look forward to the comments in this video, and yeah, I'll be reading every comment as usual. Thanks.